The immanent frame, a concept developed by Charles Taylor, refers to the emergence of the interlocking cosmic, sociopolitical, and moral orders, mediated by the mother institutional structures of democratic states, economic markets, scientific or science and technology, and mass media, all of which are secular and immanent, that is, without any vertical transcendent referent, and thus function etsi Deus non daretur, as if God would not exist. The expression goes back to Ugo Grotius' attempt to ground a system of international law without any divine or transcendent referent. In this respect, the early modern Westphalian system of states was a secular one. Each of the states assumed absolute sovereignty vis-à-vis the other, even if each of them was also a confessional state, in the sense that they enforce the religious confessionalization of their subjects. But the first literally modern secular state, the United States of America, was born actually as a secular state without previous confessionalization. It's also a state etsi Deus non daretur, but it was based on the so-called wall of separation between church and state, instituted by the dual clause of the First Amendment, which prohibits any religious establishment at the state level while protecting the free exercise of each and all religions in civil society. As the history of the United States shows, however, separation of church and state does not mean the separation of religion and politics. And the segregation of the state can go hand in hand with periodical religious revivals of all kinds within society. Similarly, as the critique of global financial capitalism released yesterday by the Vatican reminded us, American capitalist markets function also etsi Deus non daretur, even though many of the capitalist tycoons themselves may be religious believers. Similarly, American scientific institutions, which as we know have produced a majority of Nobel Prizes in sciences in World War II, also function etsi Deus non daretur. Yet many of these scientists may possibly be believers, and certainly large sectors of the American population believe in creationism in the same way as other sectors of the American population may believe in Darwinian evolutionism. Throughout my work, I've insisted on the need to differentiate between three dynamics which to Europeans at least appear as intrinsically interconnected aspects of a single process of secularization. Those three dynamics are the institutionalization of the immanent frame through the emancipation and differentiation of the secular spheres of states, markets, and science from religion. B, the privatization of religion. And three, the decline of religious beliefs and practices. In European developments, these three dynamics appear indeed intrinsically rather than contingently interrelated. Perhaps this was the price European Christianity had to pay for its role in what Marcel Gauchet calls the exit from religion, that is, the institutionalization of the secular immanent frame. But within this immanent frame, all kinds of religious and secular dynamics are possible. Indeed, in the rest of the world, the globalization of the immanent frame is not necessarily accompanied by the exit from religion, that is, by the privatization and decline of religion. It may be accompanied rather by all types of religious transformations in different directions, as the religious secular binary system of classification that emerged within Western Christianity enters in dynamic transformative interaction with all non-Western systems of classification, pre-axial as well as axial. All the religio-cultural systems, Christian and non-Christian, Western and non-Western, have been and continue being transformed through these global interactive dynamics. Let me offer as illustration a brief comparative analysis of some of the divergent religious and secular dynamics in post-colonial China and post-colonial India. China. China has had a long and relatively continuous state system with some persistent patterns of state regulation and management of religion. The relations between state and society in China for more than 2,000 years have been significantly different than those of the West. Indeed, the very division between state, church, and society, upon which both the Council of Civil Society and the separation of church and state were based in the Christian West, are hardly applicable to China. The plurality of autonomous and competing corporatist structures, such as Pope, Emperor and Kings, feudal lords and bishops, autonomous townships and burghers, all claiming their different rights and privileges and contesting them in separate courts, which are the institutional antecedents of the modern system of democratic state and civil society in the West, are also unknown in China. For a much longer period of time, and for a much larger territory than any Western state, the Chinese imperial system administered a highly effective system of domestic social order based on Confucian moral principles of harmony shared by state officials and local elites, and on political principles of welfare and surveillance with relatively low levels of coercion. But the imperial system collapsed at the end of the 19th century, unable to meet the challenges of various domestic rebellions and the foreign pressures of the unequal treaties imposed by European powers and the Sino-Japanese War. In this respect, there was a radical break in China between the ancient imperial regime and the modern republican nationalist state in all its forms: republican, nationalist, namely Kuomintang, and communist. Nowhere was this break more radical, perhaps, than in the field of religion. I say the field of religion because it is by no means simple to draw a clear distinction between the religious and the secular in Chinese culture and politics. Properly speaking, the modern term religion, Songjiao, was introduced first at the end of the 19th century as a neologism modeled after the Japanese term Shukyu, as almost a direct translation, which we analyzed yesterday, to render the Western concept of religion with a very concrete connotation of a sectarian group. Following Mayfair Young, one can distinguish four different phenomena constituting what retrospectively could be called the broader field of religion in late imperial China. There was first the imperial state cult and orthodoxy, including reverence of Confucius and Confucian doctrines, which combine Jixi, sacrifices and reverences, and Jiao, teachings. It has been a prerogative of the Chinese states in ancient times to distinguish authoritatively between the upright order, orthodox teaching, or right path, and the evil, crooked forces of chaos, heresy, heretical sayings, heretical doctrines or teachings, and heterodox ways. The distinction between orthodoxy and heterodoxy has been in this respect always constitutive of the Chinese political and religious system. There was secondly the realm of village or community religion, the so-called Chinese folk religion, which was in some respects continuous with the state cult, but had also its own distinctive characteristics. It was this realm of community religion that became characterized as superstition, mixing, another modern Western neologism forming a dyadic relationship with Songjiao, with religion, and which became the target of modernizing reformers and radicals from the early 20th century on. Thirdly, there were the licensed religious traditions of Buddhism and Taoism, which had a weak institutional form by the end of the imperial system as the providers of ritual services for ordinary people. But many of their rites and ideas had also been incorporated symbiotically into community religion. Those were the religions, namely Buddhism and Taoism, which along with Islam and the Western Christian religions proper Protestantism and Catholicism were incorporated into the 5 officially recognized religions, namely Songjiao, early in the Republican era, which have continued to enjoy, at least in principle, freedom of religion during the People's Republic, although all of them were severely repressed for decades under communist rule. Finally, there were the numerous popular religious societies or sects, many of which were informed by the syncretism of the 3 teachings, the Sanjiao of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and many of which had also a redemptive program to save the world and transform the self. Falun Gong, or the numerous societies of the Qigong movement, can be viewed as contemporary versions of such religious societies. Now, the post-imperial state, with its progressive goal of modernizing Chinese society and the nation in order to free itself from Western colonial domination, introduced a radical reorganization of the traditional Chinese religious field through administrative regulation. The state was made secular by abolishing the imperial cult, the imperial state cult, although this was by no means incompatible with the later introduction of the cult of Mao. But in addition, the state became pronouncedly secularist through aggressive intervention in the sphere of religion by drawing new modern administrative distinctions between religion proper, Zhongjiao, which could be tolerated under strict state control, and superstition on the one hand, and reactionary sects, secret societies, and evil cults on the other, which had to be repressed. The 5 religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism, are today officially recognized by the state and at least formally protected by the constitutionally recognized freedom of religion. But all 5 religions function under strict state regulation after having been reorganized into centralized national religious institutions modeled after the European pattern. Religious diversities in this respect severely circumscribed within the officially recognized religion. Every other form of religion is in principle illegal, must lead an underground existence, and is subject to repression. One fateful consequence of the narrowing classification of Zhongjiao with this particularistic conception of sectarian group was the dissociation of Confucianism from the sphere of religion. Indeed, while in the Western Academy, Confucianism continued to be considered one of the major world religions, along with Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., in China it ceased to be a religion. Moreover, since Buddhism and Taoism also have a relatively small number of formally affiliated members in China, the ultimate result of the administrative regulation of Zhongjiao is that the official classification leaves out the majority of the ethnic Chinese, the Han population, as secular and non-religious. Indeed, with the exception of Taoism, all the other 4 official religions, Buddhism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism, can easily be depicted from a nativist nationalist perspective as foreign and as un-Chinese. As Peter van der Veer has shown, under the slogan "Smash temples, build schools," superstition has been repeatedly repressed through violent iconoclastic modernizing campaigns, which began with the 4th May movement and culminated in the Cultural Revolution. Every form of folk religion, superstition, and magic became the efficient sign of national backwardness to be blamed for the national humiliation. The traditional Mandarin elitist Confucian suspicion of folk religion and superstition became fused with Western secularist and atheist scientific ideologies in a particular virulent combination. Today, the violent anti-superstition campaigns have been lifted, and one can witness a revival of community religion, particularly in southern China. But the widespread anti-religious secularist bias persists throughout China, particularly among the elites and within the communist regime. Indeed, the Chinese secular religious field remains closer to the European secularist model than to the American one, or as we will see, to the Indian one. China is one of the few non-Western countries in which a stadial secularist consciousness, which identifies religion with backward tradition and modernity and progress with science, secularity and irreligion, has become dominant. Yet, after 6 decades of forced secularization from above, combining brutal repression and atheist indoctrination and propaganda, the results have been mixed and ambiguous at best. On the one hand, the Chinese population remains secular, on the surface at least, as little religious as the most secularized Western European societies. But on the other hand, like many post-Soviet societies, China has also been experiencing a remarkable religious revival throughout the entire religious field, from Buddhism and Taoism to Christianity and Islam, but also a revival of Confucianism and all forms of popular Chinese religion, as well as Qigong fever. The swift and brutal reaction against any perceived threat to the one-party state rule, as shown by the ongoing repression directed at various times against splitist Tibetan Buddhists, against terrorist Muslim Uyghurs, against members of the evil cult Falun Gong, or against underground Christian churches, will seem to indicate that the Chinese state still reserves for itself the right to define the boundaries between orthodoxy and heterodoxy and to repress heretic deviations violently. In this respect, Chinese state secularism blends seamlessly modern Western traditions of ideological secularism and etatist laicity with ancient Chinese models of sacred rule and centralized state administration of society. Now moving to India. The Indian model of secularism, in contrast to the Chinese, appears much closer to the American model. Both are governed by similar principles of no establishment and free exercise, although the principles of state neutrality and religious freedom are interpreted rather differently in both places. Both societies are explicitly non-secularist in the sense that the states, as well as their respective cultures, respect, protect, and promote religious diversity and religious pluralism. Indeed, the protection of religious pluralism, and particularly the protection of the rights of religious minorities, is in both cases the ultimate rationale for a secular state. But the Indian model of religious pluralism, based on categorical group identities or communalism, is markedly different from the radically individualist American model. Unlike the Chinese modernizing elites, which in their struggle against Western colonialism rejected every form of Chinese religion, the Indian modernizing elites, in their anti-colonial struggle against British imperialism, opted for the mobilization of all Indian religions. In this respect, all religions of India today are not traditional residues, but rather, as we saw in the case of Catholic Poland or the United States, they are the outcomes of modern mobilizations and of modern religious revivals. But while American religious revivalism is radically individualist, Indian revivalism is primarily communalist. Religious survey research in the United States shows that over a third of the adult American population has changed their religious affiliation since childhood without apparently unsettling social or political life. This would be utterly unthinkable in an Indian context in which religious conversions are radically unsettling and politically highly contentious. Let me quote from the beginning paragraph of Gauri Viswanathan's illuminating study, Outside the Fold, since it frames most succinctly and poignantly the Indian conception. So I quote, "In its most transparent meaning as a change of religion, conversion is arguably one of the most unsettling political events in the life of a society. This is irrespective of whether conversion involves a single individual or an entire community, whether it is forced or voluntary, or whether it is the result of proselytization or inner spiritual illumination. Not only does conversion alter the demographic equation within a society and produce numerical imbalances, but it also challenges and establishes communities' assent to religious doctrines and practices. With the departure of members from the fold, the cohesion of a community is under threat just as forcefully as if its beliefs had been turned into heresies. Each of the sentences is significant because it reveals fundamental differences between Christian and Hindu conceptions of religion, as well as crucial differences between the socio-political structures of pluralism in both countries. There is no doubt that religious conversion of single individuals and entire communities has been an unsettling political event in the life of Indian society from the British colonial period till the present. The debate in Bengal in the 1820s between Ram Mohan Roy and Joshua Marshman, later reenacted a few decades later by John Muir and the Pandits, already exposed the fundamental difference between Christianity and Hinduism as religious beliefs versus philosophical teachings, and as individualist salvation religion versus Dharma. These theological philosophical debates or disputes could not be separated, moreover, from the asymmetrical power dynamics of the imperial encounter between Western Christian civilization and Indian Hindu civilization. It was, above all, the conjoined universalistic claims of Christian religion, enlightenment rationalism, and Western science that provoked the Indian particularist response of the rational superiority of Hindu Dharma over Christian religion and the spiritual superiority of Eastern wisdom over materialist Western scientific knowledge. Wouter van der Veer has shown how this colonial response was radically different from the Chinese one, shaping the very different dynamics of Indian and Chinese secularism in their attitude towards tradition, superstition, religion, science, and the role of the state in modernization projects. Moreover, once the British colonial administration had fixated and solidified the boundaries of caste and religious communities, religious conversions did indeed alter the demographic equation of the anti-colonial projects of Hindu and Muslim nationalism, contributing to communalist violence that culminated in the trauma of partition between India and Pakistan. Mass conversions of the press classes to Christianity became particularly unsettling in the context of the anti-colonial Indian nationalist project, prompting Gandhi to advocate the prohibition not only of conversion, but of missionary work as a whole. Gandhi's understanding of Satya reiterated the basic Hindu non-exclusivist position that all religions express a search for the truth, and as such they are all equal. It is on the basis of the equality of all religions and the equal respect which all of them deserve that proselytism becomes offensive. This is the high philosophical ground. The particularism of nationalism added a more down-to-earth rationale. Countering the arguments of Christian universalism, Gandhi retorted that, quote, every nation's religion is as good as any other. Certainly India's religions are adequate for her people, and India stands no need of conversion from one faith to another, end of quote. Most importantly, in the face of the anti-colonial struggle against British rule, mass conversions of Harijans to Christianity amounted, if not to national treason, certainly to abetting the enemy, undermining the principle of Swadeshi, or self-reliance. India needed not only economic and political self-reliance, but also religious self-reliance. Christianity, in Gandhi's view, was somewhat un-Indian. imposed upon the people against their will, indeed, the religion of the oppressors. Hindu-Muslim unity, by contrast, was of utmost importance for the project of Indian independence, and Gandhi never expressed any view of Islam as an Indian religion. But Hindu nationalism, especially Hindutva, would later most easily extend the logic of Gandhi's argument to Islam. Indeed, the series of acts of Hindu personal law passed in the mid-1950s made a clear distinction between the native Hindu religions of India, namely Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, and the foreign religions of India, namely Islam, Christianity, Parsis, or Judaism. Much of this legislation was directed at prescribing the conversion of the scheduled caste to non-Hindu religions, particularly to Christianity and Islam. The same rationale was later applied to the scheduled tribes, making their conversion to Hinduism legitimate, while their conversion to Christianity or other non-Hindu religions was deemed illegitimate. Hindu apologists always reiterate the argument contrasting the Hindu majority religious outlook, which expresses tolerance and respect for all religious beliefs, with the exclusivist outlook of a minority religion like Christianity, quote, which denounces all religious beliefs except its own and is determined to convert others. Equally relevant is the fundamental contrast between native religions, such as Hinduism or Judaism, which stress the duty of members to keep the identity they are born with and to protect the religious heritage of their forefathers, and born-again religions like Christianity, which stress the inalienable right of the individual to select the religion of their choice. While internally Hinduism may be the most tolerant, diverse, and pluralist of religions, to such an extent that the very categories of orthodoxy and heterodoxy become meaningless. Externally, however, crossing communal boundaries and departing from the fold become acts of heresy and apostasy. This brief comparison between China and India shows how the globalization of the immanent frame, particularly through the institutionalization of the mother nation state, may lead to very different religious and secular dynamics. Indeed, the patterns of state secularism and state management of religion are significantly different throughout the world in all religious traditions. In previous lectures, we contrasted three significantly different patterns within the Christian West. The Nordic Scandinavian model is one of relative fusion and collaboration between the religious and the secular, between the ecclesiastical institution of the Lutheran State Church and the secular national civil religion. The French republican model of laïcité is grounded in a radical model of separation and confrontation between the religious and the secular, between the ecclesiastical Catholic Church and the republican national civil religion. In the American model, there is separation, but not confrontation between church and state, and there are diffuse boundaries and reciprocal mutual influences between the religious and the secular, between the religious denominations and the national civil religion. One could find similar examples of those three patterns of collaboration, confrontation, and mutual influence of the religious and the secular practically anywhere in the world and in all religious traditions. Within the world of Islam, for instance, the Kingdom of Morocco offers a long-evolving pattern of collaboration between the religious and the secular, somewhat similar to the Nordic establishment model. Turkey, at least under Ataturk, offered a model of religious-secular confrontation which had some similarities with the French laicist model, although there was no true separation insofar as the Turkish secular state took over the official management of Islam. Post-colonial Senegal, while also adapting from France the discourse of laïcité, added to it the qualifier laïcité bien entendu. Laïcité, rightly understood, means that the task of the secular state is not to either privatize Islam or to impose an official model of state Islam upon the entire nation, but rather to respect and protect the intra-religious pluralism of Muslim Sufi brotherhoods without privileging any of them, and equally to respect and protect non-Muslim, primarily Christian religious communities. In this respect, Senegalese secularism is more akin to the American model. Indonesian secularism, as reflected in the civil secular principle of Pancasila, also resembles more the Senegalese and the American model than the Moroccan or the Turkish one. It should be clear by now that everywhere the global expansion of the immanent frame leads to the institutionalization of different kinds of secular regimes, which become interconnected with very different religious dynamics. It should be equally obvious that when people around the world use the same category of religion, they actually mean very different things. The actual concrete meaning of whatever people denominate as religion can only be elucidated in the context of their particular discursive practices. But the very fact that the same category of religion is being used globally across cultures and civilizations testifies to the global expansion of the modern secular religious system of classification of reality, which first emerged in the modern Christian West. While the religious secular system of classification of reality may have become globalized, what remains hardly disputed and debated almost everywhere in the world today is how, where, and by whom the proper boundaries between the religious and the secular ought to be drawn. There are, in this respect, multiple competing secularisms, as there are multiple and diverse forms of religious fundamentalist resistance to those secularisms. Paradoxically, the global institutionalization of the secular immanent frame becomes the very guarantor of the post-axial secular religious system, which guarantees the equal, non-hierarchic, free exercise of religion to all forms of religion, pre-axial, axial, and post-axial. Indeed, what characterizes the contemporary global moment is the fact that all forms of human religion, past and present, from the most primitive to the most modern, are available for individual and collective appropriation. Equally relevant, moreover, is the fact that increasingly they must learn to coexist side by side in today's global cities. This contemporary social fact tends to put into question all teleological schemes of religious rationalization and development, which tended to place primitive and traditional forms of religion as older human cultural forms to be superseded by more modern, secular, and rational ones. While at the level of the nation-state, religious dynamics are mainly conditioned by particular forms of secular regimes and by different patterns of state management of religious freedom and religious pluralism, at the global level, we are clearly witnessing the emergence of what I call global denominationalism. It is the proliferation of deterritorialized, transnational, global imagined communities, or global ummas, we can also call them, encompassing the so-called old world religions, as well as many new forms of hybrid globalized religions, such as the Baha'is, the Munis, the Hare Krishnas, Afro-American religions, Falun Gong, etc., that I call emerging global denominationalism. Of course, they compete with many other forms of secular imagined communities, as well as with modern nationalism. The emerging global denominationalism in this respect includes religious as well as secular denominations. By denominationalism, I mean a system of mutual recognition of groups within society. It is the name we give to ourselves and the name by which others recognize us. Indeed, distinctive of the American system of religious denominationalism is the fact that it is not state-regulated, that it is voluntary, and that it is a system of mutual recognition of group identities. The process of constitution of a global system of religions can best be understood as a process of global religious denominationalism, whereby all the so-called world religions are redefined and transformed in contraposition to the secular through interrelated reciprocal processes of particularistic differentiation, universalistic claims, and mutual recognition. As Roland Robertson has emphasized, universal particularism and particular universalism are intrinsically interrelated and inherent in process of globalization. Each world religion claims its universal right to be unique and different, that's its particularism, while at the same time presenting itself globally as a universal path for all of humanity. Like internal denominationalism in the United States, global denominationalism is emerging as a self-regulated system of religious pluralism and mutual recognition of religious groups in global civil society. Global denominationalism emerges through a process of mutual recognition of the particular and universal claims. Returning to Durkheim's theory of the sacred, one could argue that the cult of the individual and the sacralization of humanity is emerging as the global civil religion. In this context, Durkheim was simply following a long line of Enlightenment prophets, Saint-Simon and Comte being the most prominent among them, who had assumed that the new religion of humanity would sooner or later replace the old theocentric religions. The triumphant global expansion of human rights principles seemed to confirm part of their visions. What none of these prophets could have anticipated, however, was the fact that the all gods and the all religions whose death Durkheim announced would gain new life by becoming the carriers of the process of sacralization of humanity. And we could give the example of Catholicism as the most paradigmatic one. Of those human rights principles, the right to religious freedom is probably paramount. But the fact that religious freedom is becoming a universal aspiration does not mean that religious freedom means necessarily the same thing everywhere. It may mean different things in different countries, in different cultures, and in different religious traditions, and these different meanings may be in conflict with one another. The individualist principle of free exercise of religion may be in fundamental tension with the collective principle of the free exercise of the religious culture of one's own group. Global public opinion surveys show that the overwhelming majority of the population in every religious culture, Christian as well as Jewish, Muslim as well as Hindu or Buddhist, affirm the freedom of religion is very important to them. In this respect, one may speak of a growing global consensus over the principle of free exercise of religion. Yet it is obvious that Christians and Jews, Hindus, Muslims and Buddhists may have very different cultural conceptions of what the free exercise of religion may entail. Clearly, the ongoing process of mutual recognition of all religions and of mutual recognition of the religious and the secular is not smooth and may be accompanied by violent conflicts between religious groups as well as between religious and secular worldviews. It is all part of the global struggle for universal, particular, human mutual recognition. It is an open empirical question which should be the central focus of a global sociology of religion, how these ongoing global processes of secularization, sacralization, and religious denominationalism, which we have analyzed in these lectures, are mutually interrelated in different civilizations sometimes symbiotically, as in religious nationalist fusions or in the religious defense of human rights, but often antagonistically, as in the violent conflicts between the sacred, secular, immanent norm of freedom of expression and transcendent theistic norms, as we've seen so often in the conflicts over the caricatures of the Prophet or blasphemy, etc. A mode of conclusion, let me reiterate once again that global humanity is becoming simultaneously more religious and more secular, but in significantly different ways, in different types of secular regimes, in different religious traditions, and in different civilizations. Thank you very much for your kind attention throughout the 4 lectures.